very glad to be here. My luggage actually is still en route from Chicago, so given the choice between my making it and the luggage not, and the luggage making it and my not, I think I'll take being able to be here, even if half my stuff is still on the plane. I'm also really glad to see so many people here, because when Colleen was driving away from the airport yesterday, she said, well, we're a little bit worried because it's a gorgeous day and the weather's not been very nice lately, and we think everyone may decide to go outside during the day, which is normally a very perfectly good thing to do on a Saturday, but we wanted people here, and I'm so glad to see that there are a lot of people here. What I wanted to do today is to talk about, and then I'll answer questions afterwards and have a little bit of conversation, about how we act in this hard time for peace and justice. Because I think many of us hit a huge sort of just wave of disappointment and frustration after last November's election, working, very, very hard to try and change directions of this country. Although, the people who are working in Pennsylvania did succeed in carrying that state, so that was a good thing. But still, the sense that you give it your all, and you try, and then where does that leave you? And I had the same experience talking to people right after the initial phase of the Iraq War, where they said, we marched, we leafleted, we called our legislators, we vigiled, we did all the things that you're supposed to do as a citizen, and then went to war anyway. And I feel so helpless, and I feel so powerless. And part of what I've tried to do, in fact, the last book, The Impossible will take a little while, is a response to that sense of powerlessness, is to look at how do we really keep going and make this lifetime work in bringing about a more just world. Because one of the things that's very clear to me is that when people come in and then cycle through, that doesn't build a durable movement. You need long runners. You need people in for the long haul. And one of the other things that's very clear is that I think it's easy to assume that we know how history is going to turn. And you look at the president, and the president doesn't necessarily seem so good, and mess in Iraq and global warming and widening gaps between rich and poor, and Republicans about to attempting to dynamite 200 years of constitutional history and ram their judges through. I mean, all that is very real and serious and urgent. And it's, again, so easy to feel overwhelmed by it. And so how do we proceed, living in a hard time and living in a time where the fruits may be a little bit delayed? But part of it, I think, is to recognize that, again, history doesn't just sort of emerge out of random action. It emerges out of actions of courage and conscience. And you don't know who's going to play out. I use the Rosa Parks story as an example. And there's a kind of myth that's grown up surrounding it. The image is, this is the CNN version, I call it, because I was on a CNN show with Parks, and she was on my phone, so I didn't meet her. But they're introducing her, and they're saying, one day Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus, and that started the civil rights movement. And I'm thinking, well, excuse me, how could it have started the civil rights movement when Parks herself had been a civil rights activist for 12 years with the NAACP and took trainings at Highlander Center, the Labor and Civil Rights Center. It's still going in Tennessee this summer before her arrest. And it was this image of this sort of woman stepping out of nowhere into history in isolation, single-handedly changing things and things instantly changing. And simply not true, because if you actually, again, you looked at it, very much part of a community. I mean, there was a guy named E.D. Nixon, who's a labor activist, he worked as a sleeping car porter, taking suitcases on the trains, and was an activist in the Sleeping Car Porters Union, founded by the legendary labor organizer A. Phil Randolph. And he was the one who actually got Martin Luther King involved, who was just a young pastor in his first ministry. So there's a group of women over to, it was a historic black college, basically funded like at the level of high school, barely. And they were the ones who organized the leafleting the day after Parks was arrested. So there's a whole larger community which gets stripped away by the myths. And part of the problem, of course, is that if we think of ourselves as lone activists, then it becomes almost impossible to imagine changing anything. But if you think of people acting in community, which is one reason that communities like this are so important and powerful, then there's so much more that can be accomplished. But that gets stripped away. The image that's sort of accidental action. I remember even Garrison Keillor, who I really like very much and was listening to one day, said, well, meaningly, but wrong, oh, Rosa Parks wasn't an activist. She was just a woman with groceries who was tired. And I thought, no, she was an activist, which means somebody who intentionally acts. And that doesn't mean that you know exactly how things are going to turn out. But it's always a leap of faith. My friend Jim Wallace from Sojourners, he says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change, which I like very much. That is, you look at the evidence now, it may look bleak, it doesn't look so great, but it's by our actions that we're able to change it. And that was certainly the case in Parks' history. If you look at the point that she started out a dozen years earlier, they're taking on issues like lynching. I mean, an enormously dark chapter in America's history. And yet only by taking on those very difficult issues, where, in fact, to take them on was to invite the same fate. Through that courage, a movement begins to build that then overspills the boundaries of the initial area that it's taking on, and ends up creating something to, at least begin changing some of the fundamental dynamics in this country. And so, part of the challenge is to recognize that those kind of, I describe it, the mix of intentionality and faith, that you have to have both. I mean, you have to have the really humble actions. I mean, Parks was the secretary of the NAACP logo, and you didn't get the network news cameras zooming in saying, Rosa Parks is making history, she's taking minutes at a meeting. But that was part of making history as well. Just those sort of very simple things of building a community, nurturing it, helping it stay together, and bringing it into force as a voice for conscience. And oftentimes I think we denigrate those actions and we think, well, I'm just doing this, it's not really very important. But in fact, any time that we're trying to build a community for change, any time that we're bringing new people in, any time we're taking a voice of conscience to a place where it isn't usually taken, we are still doing something powerful. And we never know exactly how that's going to play out in history. So I think that's worth noting. And then just the aspect of perseverance. I mean, imagine if Parks had given up in year 3 or 5 or 7 or 10. I mean, we'd never have heard of her. And so it's by that keeping on and recognizing that sometimes just change lies over the horizon, and the last thing impossible taking was a combination of my own writings and powerful figures from around the world. And I love the stories of Václav Havel, former Czech president, and he's describing the growth of their democracy movement in Czechoslovakia. And he's writing in 1986, which means he's writing 3 years before the dictatorship is overthrown. And he's writing at a point when most observers believe that those Eastern European dictatorships were simply going to continue. And so it took a kind of far-sighted vision to be able to look over the horizon, which is what he was doing nonetheless, and all those others struggling for change. And he traces their movement back, of all things, to, especially there's a rock band, a Czech rock band called the Plastic People of the Universe, who were influenced by some fairly rowdy American musicians like Frank Zappa and the Velvet Underground. And the authorities didn't like the music at all, and they said it was morbid and not socially constructive, which I just thought was a great bureaucratic phrase. It actually, I have to say, it reminded me of George Bush and the Dixie Chicks a little bit. It's just sort of like, if this music is something you don't like, and because it's challenging you obviously don't think it's very socially constructive. But that was precisely why they got into trouble, because they were challenging the regime. And so they harassed and they pulled the musicians' union cars so they couldn't make a living, and they broke up their concerts, and they started jailing the prime members of the band. And Havel was a little bit older and a little bit more respectable, formed a defense committee. And what was so interesting is that defense committee evolved into a group called Charter 77 that was the pivotal democracy group in Czechoslovakia that ultimately organized the resistance that brought down the regime. And so you think about it, here you are at one point, you're organizing the defense of a group of artists. And then over here, you're bringing down a dictatorship.